This is not a video about weight loss. It is not a video about diet culture. And it is definitely not a video about whether Amy Schumer looks better or worse than she did before. This is a video about storytelling. Because when someone says, "I did this to survive," and then needs 3 paragraphs, 5 explanations, and a medical backstory to defend it, the real question is no longer about health. It is about control. Control over the narrative. Control over criticism. Control over who is allowed to ask questions and who is not. If this were simply a personal health decision, why did it need to be performed so publicly, so defensively, and with so many contradictions built into the explanation? Tonight, we are not here to judge a body. We are here to examine a story, how it was told, why it changed, and what it says about the culture that demands it be told this way. Because this story is not really about Amy Schumer. It is about what happens when truth becomes flexible and explanation becomes armor. When an Instagram post looks like a crime scene, the first thing people noticed was not the message. It was the mess. The Instagram post did not read like an announcement. It did not sound like clarity, and it certainly did not feel like peace. There was no punctuation. Thoughts ran into each other. Text moved in multiple directions, as if the ideas could not agree on where to land. This was not communication. This was overflow. And that matters because people who feel secure in their decisions usually do not explain themselves like this. They do not stack defenses before anyone has even attacked. They do not preemptively apologize, correct imagined accusations, and argue with critics who have not yet spoken. A polished statement reassures the audience. A rambling one reassures the speaker. And this post felt less like sharing and more like someone trying to convince themselves in real time. Not that something was wrong, but that something was being questioned. When celebrities want to clarify a misunderstanding, they issue statements. When they want control, they curate interviews. But when they feel exposed, they post like this. This was not a declaration of confidence. It was a reaction. And reactions tell us more than explanations ever do. Because before we even get to what Amy Schumer said, we have to ask why she felt the need to say it this way. And once you ask that question, the story stops being about weight and starts being about fear. When the story starts to change, here is where the narrative begins to slip. Not because of what was said, but because of what no longer lines up. At first, the story was simple. Amy Schumer spoke publicly about having Cushing syndrome. She said it was rare. She said it was difficult. And she said clearly that it would work itself out. That mattered. Because a condition that resolves on its own does not require emergency framing. It does not demand urgency, and it certainly does not demand moral justification. But then the story shifted. Suddenly, the weight loss was not a choice. It was survival. The same condition was now described as life-threatening. The same decision was now described as unavoidable. And questioning it was no longer disagreement, it was cruelty. This is not about medicine. This is about narrative flexibility. When a story changes in response to criticism, it stops being an explanation. It becomes a defense strategy. Because truth does not need upgrades, it does not need escalation, and it does not need to be rewritten to remain convincing. If the motivation was always health, why did the language evolve only after the backlash? And if the story was always this serious, why was it once described as manageable? These are not hostile questions, they are logical ones. And the moment a public figure treats logical questions as personal attacks, the story stops being transparent. It becomes protected. And protected stories are rarely told for clarity. They are told for control. By this point, the issue is no longer what Amy Schumer did. It is how quickly the explanation adjusted to make disagreement feel unacceptable. When illness becomes a moral shield. This is the moment where the conversation changes shape. Because illness, once introduced into a public narrative, does more than explain behavior. It reorganizes the rules. When someone says, "I did this to survive," the statement does not ask to be understood. It demands to be accepted. Disagreement is no longer a difference of opinion. It becomes a moral failure. And that is where this story crosses a line. Not because illness is being discussed, but because it is being positioned as a shield against scrutiny, a shield against contradiction, a shield against the simplest question of all: why? Once survival is invoked, every response is filtered through guilt. If you question the decision, you lack empathy. If you analyze the narrative, you are insensitive. If you notice inconsistencies, you are cruel. That framing does not invite dialogue, it shuts it down. And the danger here is not personal, it is cultural. Because when celebrities normalize this structure, they teach the audience that certain stories are untouchable, not because they are true, but because they are emotionally fortified. And once a story is fortified, truth becomes secondary to tone. At that point, we are no longer listening to information, we are being instructed on how to feel. And when emotion replaces examination, control quietly takes its place. This is not about denying illness. It is about recognizing when illness is used not to inform, but to silence. And once you see that shift, you cannot unsee it. 2 images, 1 uncontrolled moment. Words can be shaped. Images are harder. On Instagram, everything is intentional. The angle is chosen. The lighting is negotiated. The posture is adjusted again and again until the story feels right. A staircase becomes a stage. A lean back tightens the face. A still frame suggests confidence, effortlessness, arrival. This is not deception, it is curation. And curation is how public figures survive. But then there is the other image, the one without permission, the one without preparation, the one taken mid-step, mid-expression, mid-reality. A paparazzi photograph does not argue, it does not explain, it does not defend itself. It simply exists. And the discomfort people feel when they see that contrast has nothing to do with weight. It has everything to do with control. Because when 2 images tell 2 different stories, the question is not which one is flattering. The question is which one needed help to exist. A controlled image asks you to believe. An uncontrolled one asks nothing at all. It just shows up. And when that happens, the narrative tightens. Not because the truth has been revealed, but because control has briefly slipped. And in that brief moment, we are reminded that image is not reality. It is negotiation. This story is not unique. At this point, it would be easy to frame this as a single contradiction. One person, one decision, one messy explanation. But that would miss the larger pattern. Because this story has been told before. Different memes, different platforms, same arc. Public figures who once built their identity on rejecting beauty standards eventually find themselves pulled back toward them. Not because they lied at the beginning, but because the system does not reward resistance for very long. There is a window where difference is celebrated. It feels brave, it feels disruptive, and then the window closes. Visibility starts to depend on compliance. Opportunities narrow. The message softens. What once sounded like conviction begins to sound like explanation. This is not a personal failure. It is a structural one. Hollywood does not punish deviation immediately.
Bags before
It
they're
absorbs
gone.
it, then it reshapes it into something familiar. And when that happens, the individual story becomes useful, not as truth, but as proof that the system always wins. So when people ask why this explanation feels so careful, so defensive, so emotionally fortified, the answer is not insecurity, it is pressure. Because in this environment, you are allowed to accept yourself, just not for too long. The question beneath the story. This was never a story about weight. It was never really about medication, or Instagram, or even Amy Schumer. It was about permission. Who is allowed to change, and who is allowed to question that change. It was about how quickly a personal decision becomes a public performance, and how easily explanation turns into insulation. When a story is wrapped in enough emotion, enough vulnerability, enough moral urgency, it stops inviting understanding, it starts demanding agreement. And that is where the tension lives. Not in the body, not in the diagnosis, but in the silence that follows any reasonable question. Because a healthy culture can examine its stories. An honest story can withstand curiosity. So the real question is not what Amy Schumer did. The real question is this. When someone says, "This is my truth," are we still allowed to ask if it makes sense? Or has asking itself become the problem? That is the file. And it remains open.